The court did not gasp when Prince Cassian broke the engagement. They gasped when he did it kneeling not to the woman he had promised his life to, but to the healer's daughter standing behind her, in the middle of Lady Elira Ashworth's own betrothal renewal ceremony. 6 years of loyalty, 6 years of letters signed always yours, ended in front of 400 witnesses with a single sentence. I never chose you, Elira, I was chosen for you. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Elira had ever heard. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply looked at the golden ring on her finger, the one that matched his, and removed it so calmly that the Dowager Duchess beside her whispered that something in the girl had already died. What none of them knew, not Cassian, not the court, not even Elira herself in that frozen moment, was that 3 days later, a black raven bearing the seal of Viral's oldest enemy would land on her window sill, carrying a marriage proposal from the one king in the world who was never supposed to want her. And that the humiliation of one throne room was about to become the undoing of an entire kingdom. The grand hall of Ashcrest Palace smelled of white lilies and beeswax candles, the same smell it had carried at every Ashworth celebration for 200 years. Lady Elira had walked into that hall 1,000 times, but never like this, never as a woman about to renew a promise made when she was 16 years old. She wore ivory silk embroidered with silver thread shaped like wheat stalks, the sigil of her house. Her dark hair was pinned high, a single sapphire pin gifted to her by her mother before she died, 3 winters past. She stood at the center of the hall, spine straight, chin level, the way her father had trained her since childhood. A duke's daughter does not tremble in front of a crowd, he used to say, even when the crowd is waiting for her to break. Prince Cassian stood across from her, golden-haired, broad-shouldered, dressed in the deep blue of the Viral royal house. He had always been beautiful in the way spoiled things are beautiful, polished, admired, never once tested. Elira had loved him since she was a girl who did not yet understand that love and convenience could wear the same face. The archbishop lifted the ceremonial cord that would bind their wrists together for the renewal vow. The crowd, dukes, duchesses, foreign envoys, her own weeping aunt in the second row, leaned forward in practiced silence. And then Cassian stepped back, not forward, back. A murmur rippled through the hall like wind through wheat. Elira's hand, already extended for the cord, hung in the air a moment too long before she lowered it. Cassian. Her voice was quiet, meant only for him, though in a silent hall of 400 people, quiet still carries. He did not look at her. He looked past her shoulder, toward the side entrance of the hall, where a young woman in a plain gray healer's dress stood frozen, one hand pressed to her mouth. Elira recognized her, Leora Bennett, the physician's apprentice who had treated Cassian for a fever 8 months ago, during the border sickness that swept through the eastern garrisons. Elira herself had thanked the girl personally, had sent her a basket of oranges as a gift for saving the prince's life. She had not known then that gratitude could be mistaken for an invitation. I can't do this, Cassian said, and his voice cracked in a way that made several noblewomen in the front rows actually gasp aloud. I have tried, Elira. Gods know I have tried to want the future everyone built for us, but I never chose you. I was chosen for you by our fathers, by treaties, by a kingdom that needed our 2 houses joined like cattle in a pen. He drew a breath. I love someone else. The archbishop's ceremonial cord slipped from his hands and hit the marble floor with a sound far too small for what it meant. Elira felt 400 pairs of eyes shift from Cassian to her, waiting, hungry some of them for the collapse, for tears. For a scene worthy of the scandal sheets that would print this by morning regardless. She looked down at the golden betrothal ring on her right hand. It had been her mother's ring before it was hers, reforged with a new stone the year she turned 16. She thought distantly of how strange it was that a piece of metal could carry the weight of 6 years and somehow still feel light enough to slip off with one motion. She did. Then you should have told me in private, she said, and her voice did not shake. Not in front of my mother's friends, not in front of the archbishop, not in front of a girl who clearly did not ask to be dragged into this humiliation either. She turned briefly toward Leora, whose face had gone the color of old parchment. I am sorry this became your burden too. Then she set the ring on the small silver tray the archbishop still held, turned on her heel, and walked the full length of the grand hall alone, her silver-threaded train dragging behind her like a banner of surrender that refused to actually surrender. She did not run. She did not stumble. She walked exactly as her father taught her, and it was the sheer, unnatural steadiness of her spine that would be whispered about in Viral's drawing rooms for the next 3 months, long after the scandal itself had grown stale. What the court did not see was what happened after the doors of the grand hall closed behind her. Elira made it exactly as far as the 3rd pillar of the outer corridor before her knees betrayed her, and she pressed her back to the cold stone, sliding down until she sat crumpled in her mother's ivory silk, silver wheatstalk embroidery crushed beneath her. She did not sob loudly. She simply shook, silent and violent, both hands pressed over her mouth, as though the sound of her own grief might be a second humiliation she could not survive. Her lady's maid Fenna found her there minutes later and said nothing, only sat down on the cold floor beside her mistress and held her hand until the shaking stopped. "They will say I am cold," Elira finally whispered. "They will say I did not love him because I did not cry in that hall." "Let them," Fenna said. "You will not give this palace the satisfaction of your tears twice." Elira laughed, a broken, humorless sound. Once was already too many. She did not know in that moment that her father, Duke Reynard Ashworth, was already 3 floors above her in his study staring at a letter that had arrived that very morning. A letter he had not yet opened. Sealed with black wax and stamped with a crest he had spent 30 years learning to hate. The twin-headed wolf of Noxfall, the enemy kingdom across the Vareth Strait, the kingdom Viral had fought 2 brutal border wars against in her father's own lifetime. He turned the letter over in his hands 3 times before finally breaking the seal, half expecting a declaration of war dressed in diplomatic language, the way Noxfall's letters so often were. What he found inside was something far stranger, far more dangerous. A single line, written in a hand too elegant for a war king, too precise for a bluff. "I wish to marry your daughter." Signed simply, Draven, King of Noxfall. Duke Ashworth read the line 4 times before he understood he was not misreading it. Then he sat down heavily in his chair, because he understood something else, too, something that made his blood run cold even as a strange, cautious hope flickered somewhere beneath it. Whatever had just happened in that grand hall, whatever humiliation had just been visited on his daughter in front of the entire Viral court, the enemy kingdom already knew about it, and they had moved before the ink on the broken engagement was even dry. Duke Ashworth did not sleep that night. By dawn he had read King Draven's letter 11 more times, and each reading unsettled him further because there was no threat hidden in it, no clever trap he could find between the lines, only a plain, almost blunt request. Utterly unlike the Noxfall he remembered from the war councils of his youth, he summoned Elira to his study before breakfast. She arrived pale, hollow-eyed from a night without rest, still wearing yesterday's exhaustion like a second skin. "I assume you have already heard the whole palace talking," she said, sitting across from him, her voice flat. "I have heard something far stranger than palace gossip." He slid the letter across the desk. Elira read it once, then again. Her eyebrows drew together in genuine confusion, the first real expression to cross her face since the grand hall. "This is a joke, or a threat wearing pleasant words." "I thought so too," her father admitted. "But Noxfall does not usually bother with pleasant words when they mean threat." When Draven's father wanted war, he simply declared it. "This," he tapped the parchment, "is something else." "Why me?" Elira asked. "He has never met me. I have never set foot past the Vareth Strait. Noxfall and Viral have hated each other for 2 generations. His father killed my uncle at Thornvale Pass. Mine killed his cousin at the same battle. What could he possibly want with the daughter of the man whose house helped burn half his border villages?" Duke Ashworth was quiet for a long moment. "I do not know his reasons. But I know timing. This letter left Noxfall's capital 9 days ago, Elira, 9 days, which means it was written and sent before Cassian ever broke his engagement to you in that hall yesterday." Elira's breath caught. "That's not possible. No one outside the palace knew the renewal ceremony would end that way. I did not know it would end that way." "Which means," her father said slowly, "either King Draven has spies inside Viral's own palace deeper than we have ever suspected, or he simply intended to make this offer regardless of whether your engagement to the crown prince survived the week." He rubbed his temples. "Either possibility should frighten me more than it does. And yet you are considering it," Elira said, watching her father's face carefully. She had inherited that skill from him, the ability to read a room, read a face, read the gap between what a person said and what they actually meant. "I am considering nothing without your consent," he said firmly. "You are not a betrothal contract to be renegotiated the morning after the last one collapsed. But I will not lie to you, daughter. Viral's treasury has bled for 11 years fortifying the Thornvale border against Noxfall raids that never fully stop. If there is truth in this offer, if Draven genuinely wants peace, and not merely a hostage with a pretty title, it could end a war that has cost this kingdom more sons than any battle in living memory." Elira sat back, absorbing the shape of what he was actually asking her, underneath the careful, fatherly language. "Would you sacrifice yourself again so soon after the last sacrifice failed you?" She thought of Cassian's voice cracking in the grand hall. "I never chose you. I was chosen for you." She thought of 400 faces watching her remove her own ring, waiting to see if she would break. Something cold and clear settled into her chest, not quite anger, not quite ambition, but a strange, sharpened cousin of both. "Bring me everything we know about King Draven of Noxfall," she said. "Everything. His campaigns, his court, his temperament, his enemies inside his own walls. If I am going to consider marrying the man half this kingdom calls a monster, I would like to know precisely what kind of monster he is before I answer." Her father studied her for a long moment, something like pride and worry warring on his face in equal measure. "You would truly consider it, after yesterday." "Yesterday," Elira said, standing, smoothing the front of her plain mourning dress. "A boy who has never once in his life had to fight for anything decided he did not want me. Perhaps it is time I discover what it feels like to be wanted by a king who has had to fight for everything." What the reports brought to her over the following 2 days painted a portrait far more complicated than the Butcher King, nickname Viral's taverns had given him. Draven Voss Noxfall had ascended Noxfall's throne at 19, when his father died of a wasting illness that some in his own court still whispered was poison, administered by his father's own brother, Duke Havar, who had wanted the crown for himself. Draven had spent the first 3 years of his reign not fighting Viral at all but fighting a civil war within his own walls. A war he had won through a combination of battlefield brilliance and, according to one intelligence report Elira read 3 times, a chilling willingness to let disloyal nobles believe they had won right up until the moment they had already lost. He had never married. He kept no mistresses that any spy could confirm. He was, by every account, disciplined to the point of severity, rising before dawn, reviewing every treasury ledger personally, trusting almost no one beyond a small handful of advisors who had bled beside him during the Civil War. And curiously, every report agreed on one more detail: Noxfall's border raids against Viral, the ones that had bled her father's treasury dry for over a decade, had slowed dramatically in the last 2 years. Not stopped, slowed. As though the king ordering them was losing his appetite for a war his father had started and he had merely inherited. Elira set the final report down and stared out her window toward the distant gray line of the Vareth Strait. The water that separated her whole known world from the kingdom that had until 3 days ago existed only as a childhood nightmare, and a line item in her father's military budget. She thought about writing a formal, cautious reply, the kind a duke's daughter was trained since birth to write, something measured, diplomatic, noncommittal. Instead, she picked up her pen and wrote something else entirely, 4 sentences, unsigned by any title, sealed with her own personal wax stamp instead of her house's crest. "Your Majesty. Before I answer a proposal that could end a war or start a worse one, I would like to understand why a king who has never seen my face wishes to marry me. If you can give me an honest answer, send it directly in your own hand with no minister's polish on it. If you cannot, do not write again." She sealed it. Sent it by her most trusted writer before her father or anyone else in the palace could talk her out of the audacity of it, and then sat by her window for 3 days straight watching the horizon, waiting to see what kind of man would answer a question like that, and whether he would answer it at all. The reply came on the 4th day, not by royal courier in Noxfall's black and silver livery, but carried by a single rider in plain travel leathers, unmarked, unescorted, as if the sender had deliberately stripped away every layer of ceremony that might have let Elira dismiss it as another minister's polish. The letter was short, painfully short for something that would decide the rest of her life. "Lady Elira, I will not pretend I have watched you from afar and fallen in love with a woman I have never met. That is the kind of lie ballad singers tell, not the kind of truth a man offers when he is asking someone to share his crown. Here is my honest answer. I need a queen who cannot be broken by a court that wants to break her. I have watched Viral's ambassadors for 6 years. Your name comes up more than any other, always with the same word attached to it: steady. My own court is full of nobles waiting for me to make one mistake so they can finish what my uncle started. I do not have room for a queen who will crumble the first time she is tested. I do not know if I could ever love you. I do know that I trust the reports of your character more than I trust most men who have sworn oaths to me in person. If that is not enough reason for you, I understand, and I will not write again. Draven." Elira read it standing at her window, and something in her chest, something that had been clenched tight since the grand hall, loosened by a fraction she did not expect. It was not romantic. It was not even particularly kind. But it was, she realized slowly, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in the entire 5 days since her engagement collapsed. Cassian had spent 6 years telling her sweet, comfortable lies about a future he never actually wanted. This stranger across the strait, this king half her kingdom called a butcher, had just told her an uncomfortable truth instead. and somehow that landed heavier and truer than every soft word Cassian had ever given her. She sat down and wrote her answer before she could talk herself out of the strangeness of what she was about to do. King Draven, you are right that I do not need love. I have already learned what love promised by a comfortable man is worth. Very little, apparently, the moment a healer's daughter smiles at him in the right light. What I want is this: I will not come to Noxfall as a hostage, a broodmare, or a trophy to prove your civil war is truly over. I will come as a queen who governs. Give me real authority over something that matters: trade, treasury, the border courts, I do not care which. And I will give you a wife who can survive your nobles and might even outmaneuver them. If you can agree to that in writing, witnessed by your own council, I will agree to the marriage. If this is merely a scheme to humiliate Viral by parading her disgraced duke's daughter through your court, withdraw the offer now, because I promise you, your majesty, I would rather die unmarried in my father's house than be anyone's second humiliation in 1 week. Elira. The response took 9 days this time, long enough that Elira had genuinely begun to believe she had scared the Wolf King off entirely, and long enough that Viral's court gossip had shifted from mocking her broken engagement to speculating in increasingly wild terms about what had truly happened to Lady Ashworth, who had not been seen at a single social function since the disaster in the Grand Hall. Cassian himself had sent 2 letters in that time, both of which Elira burned unopened in her hearth, the wax seals melting into small dark puddles that Fenna swept away without comment. When Draven's answer finally arrived, it came formally this time, sealed with Noxfall's royal crest, carried by an actual delegation of 3 black-liveried riders, and accompanied by a signed witness document bearing 7 noble seals of Noxfall's highest council. The document granted Lady Elira Ashworth, upon her marriage to King Draven Vos Nixfell, full and binding authority over the Ministry of Trade and Border Commerce, one of the 3 most powerful offices in the entire kingdom, second only to the crown and the treasury itself. Attached was a second letter, shorter than the first. You asked for real authority. I have given you more than most of my own generals ever receive. My council fought me on it for 6 days, which tells you both how much they resent it and how much I meant it when I told you I need someone who cannot be broken. Come to Noxfall, Elira, and prove them wrong. Or do not come, and I will understand, and I will not trouble you again. Draven. Elira sat with both documents spread across her father's desk for a long time before she spoke. He is either the most honest man I have ever encountered, she finally said, or the most patient liar in either kingdom. Perhaps, her father said quietly, you are the only person capable of finding out which. 3 days later, Duke Ashworth summoned the Viral court to announce that his daughter Lady Elira would marry King Draven of Noxfall within the month, sealing a peace between the 2 kingdoms that had cost 3 generations of blood to nearly achieve, and had somehow impossibly been achieved instead by the very humiliation the court had gathered to witness barely 2 weeks earlier. The announcement did not land quietly. It landed like a second scandal on top of the first, because within an hour, word reached Prince Cassian in his private chambers, where he sat with Leora Bennett's hand in his, still glowing with the relief of a scandal he believed had already run its course. He read the royal proclamation twice, his face draining of color both times, and when he finally looked up at Leora, the expression on his face was one she had never seen there before, something close to fear. She's marrying Draven, he said, almost to himself. She's marrying the Butcher King of Noxfall. Is that not a good thing? Leora asked carefully. It ends the war worry, doesn't it? Everyone will be relieved. You don't understand, Cassian said, standing so quickly his chair scraped hard against the floor. My father has spent 11 years telling every noble in this kingdom that Noxfall cannot be trusted, that Draven is a butcher who murdered his own uncle to take the throne, that any peace with them is a trap waiting to spring. And now Elira, the woman I humiliated in front of the entire court, is about to become that man's queen, with full authority over Noxfall's trade ministry. He ran a hand through his golden hair, and for the first time real panic entered his voice. If she succeeds, if she becomes powerful over there, and if my father's entire foreign policy turns out to have been built on fear of a threat that never truly existed. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Leora, watching him, felt the first cold thread of doubt slide into the warm certainty she had carried since the Grand Hall, the sense that she had simply won something, that love had simply triumphed over duty the way it did in the old songs. She was beginning to understand, though she could not yet have said why, that she had not stepped into the middle of a love story at all. She had stepped into the middle of something far larger and far more dangerous that had been moving long before she ever met Prince Cassian, and that her own arrival in his life may have only been the spark someone else had been waiting for. The road to Noxfall's capital, Ravenspire, was nothing like Elira had imagined. She had grown up on stories of a blighted, frozen kingdom full of soldiers and wolves and little else, the kind of place viral nursemaids used to frighten children into obedience. What she found instead, as her carriage crossed the Varith Strait Bridge and wound up through dark pine forests into the mountain capital, was a kingdom scarred by war but not broken by it. Farms terraced into steep hillsides, watchtowers repurposed as granaries. Children playing in village squares who stopped and stared at her viral blue traveling colors with open curiosity rather than the hatred she had braced herself for. Ravenspire Castle itself rose out of black granite cliffs, genuinely intimidating in a way that matched every nightmare, until she noticed the ivy someone had deliberately allowed to climb the eastern wall, softening the fortress's harshest lines, and the fresh flowers, real flowers arranged in the entrance hall where she was received. King Draven Voss Noxfall was waiting for her at the top of the entrance stairs, and Elira's first genuine surprise of the day was that he did not look like a butcher. He was tall, dark-haired, with a scar cutting through one dark eyebrow that gave his face a permanently skeptical expression. Even now, even watching her approach with an intensity that made half his assembled court shift uncomfortably. He wore plain black and silver, no crown, no ceremonial armor, as though he had decided ceremony was a currency he simply refused to spend on his own wedding day. "Lady Elira," he said, and his voice was quieter than she expected, rough at the edges, like a man unused to speaking more words than necessary. "You came. You gave me real authority in writing, witnessed by 7 nobles," she said. "It would have been foolish not to." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough that a ripple of surprised murmuring passed through the nearby courtiers, several of whom, Elira noted immediately, watched that almost smile with expressions closer to alarm than approval. Good asterisk, she thought. Let them be alarmed. Alarm means I have already changed something. The wedding itself was small, deliberately so, a political necessity rather than a celebration, conducted in the castle's stone chapel with barely 30 witnesses, all of them Noxfall nobility, examining the viral bride with the flat, assessing stares of people waiting for an excuse. Elira wore silver instead of white, at Draven's quiet suggestion, Noxfall's color. Not a surrender of her own house's identity, but a signal, deliberate and calculated, that she intended to belong here rather than merely be housed here. When the ceremony ended and the small crowd dispersed into the great hall for the modest wedding feast, Draven pulled her aside into an antechamber before she could be swallowed by the crowd of strangers who would now, technically, call her queen. "A warning," he said quietly without preamble. "Duke Havar's son, Lord Corvin, sits 3 seats down from the head table. His father tried to kill mine and take this throne. He lost, and I let him live, which some of my council still consider my one great mistake. Corvin has spent 8 years waiting to see if I will make another. He will test you tonight, probably before the second course is served. What does he want to see? Whether Viral's Duchess breaks as easily as court gossip claims she did in her own kingdom's throne room." Elira absorbed this without flinching. "Then I suppose I should thank you for the warning instead of the flowers." "The flowers were my steward's idea," Draven admitted, and there it was again, that almost smile gone as quickly as it arrived. "I would not have thought of it. I am told that is one of several things I need a queen for." Lord Corvin's test came exactly as promised. Halfway through the second course, in the form of a toast raised too loudly, too publicly, framed as a compliment with a blade hidden inside it. "To Noxfall's new queen," Corvin said, rising from his seat, wine goblet raised, his smile sharp as a drawn dagger, "who left her own kingdom's court in tears after her prince cast her aside for a peasant girl, and who now comes to us instead. Tell me, my lady, did you choose Noxfall, or were we simply the only crown left willing to have Viral's leftovers?" The hall went utterly silent. Even the servants froze at the edges of the room. Elira felt every eye swing toward her, the same hungry anticipation she had felt in the grand hall 2 weeks earlier, the crowd waiting again to watch a woman break in public. She set down her own goblet slowly, deliberately, and let the silence stretch a full 3 seconds longer before she spoke, long enough that even Draven, watching from beside her, went very still. "Lord Corvin," she said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hall, "I did not leave my kingdom's court in tears. I left it standing on my own feet, in front of 400 witnesses who expected me to collapse and were disappointed when I did not. As for your question, no crown in this room chose me out of pity. I negotiated authority over this kingdom's entire trade ministry before I agreed to a single vow. If you would like to test whether Viral's leftovers are capable of running Noxfall's economy better than the men who have been running it into slow decline for a decade, I would be delighted to show you the ledgers next week in front of the full council. Rather than trading insults over a wedding feast like a man too nervous to challenge me properly, a beat of silence. Then from somewhere near the back of the hall, a bark of surprised laughter, quickly smothered, but not quickly enough to hide the fact that at least one Noxfall lord had genuinely enjoyed watching Corvin get outmaneuvered at his own game. Corvin's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes went cold and calculating in a way Elira filed away immediately. The way her father had taught her to notice the exact moment a negotiation shifted from open hostility to something quieter and more dangerous. The ledgers then, Corvin said smoothly, raising his goblet again as though nothing unusual had happened at all. I do look forward to it, my queen. He sat down, the feast resumed. But Elira caught Draven's eyes across the table, and in them she saw something she had not expected to find on her wedding night in an enemy kingdom she had married for cold, calculated reasons. Something that looked almost like respect. Perhaps even the very first cautious edge of something warmer. She did not yet trust it. But for the first time since the Grand Hall, she felt something other than the numb, careful armor she had been wearing for 2 straight weeks. She felt, for one unguarded moment, genuinely alive. What she did not know, what none of them in that hall knew, was that Lord Corvin's spies had already sent word of her sharp, unexpected performance to a contact far beyond Noxfall's borders. In a kingdom neither Elira nor Draven had any reason yet to suspect. The kingdom of Ashgrave 300 miles to the south, whose ruling council had spent 11 quiet years waiting for exactly the kind of instability a new untested queen might create. True to her word. Elira presented herself before Noxfall's full council exactly 7 days after her wedding. A stack of trade ledgers under one arm, and Fenna, who had insisted on following her mistress across the strait rather than remain behind in a viral court she no longer trusted, trailing quietly a few steps behind. The council chamber was a cold, circular room lined with the carved crests of Noxfall's 12 great houses, and every one of those 12 lords now watched Elira arrange her ledgers across the central table with the polite, skeptical patience of men waiting for a woman to embarrass herself. She did not. For nearly 2 hours she walked them through failures they had apparently stopped noticing because they had grown used to them. Trade routes to the eastern provinces that had gone unused for 6 years due to old grudges against merchant families with viral blood. Tariffs so punishing on southern grain that half of Noxfall's poorer districts survived on imported flour at triple the fair price, a decade-old prohibition on viral textile trade that had done more to hurt Noxfall's own weavers starved of foreign wool than it had ever hurt viral. You have spent 11 years treating every policy as a weapon against my former kingdom, she said, closing the final ledger with a decisive snap, without noticing that half these weapons have been quietly cutting your own people instead. I am not proposing peace with Viral because I am sentimental about my homeland, my lords. I am proposing it because your grain prices are strangling your own poor, and I intend to fix that with or without your approval, since my authority over this ministry was witnessed and signed by 7 of the 12 men currently in this room. Lord Corvin, seated at the far end of the table, said nothing for a long moment, studying her with an expression that had shifted subtly from cold amusement to something more carefully guarded. And if Viral uses this reopened trade to smuggle spies, weapons, saboteurs across a border we have spent 2 generations defending, he finally asked. Then I will be the first to know, Elira said simply, since I grew up inside that court and I know precisely which merchant families in Viral have ties to smuggling and which do not. You have spent a decade trying to guess at Viral's intentions from across a closed border. I do not need to guess, I know. It was, she realized as she said it, entirely true and entirely useful in a way she had not fully calculated until the words left her mouth. She was no longer merely Viral's disgraced former betrothed. She had just, in front of Noxfall's most powerful men, made herself indispensable. The council approved her trade reforms by a vote of 9-3 that same afternoon. Corvin was among the 3 who voted against, but he voted and did not attempt to sabotage the count, which Draven later told her privately was itself a small victory. 9 votes in your first week, he said that evening, finding her still in the council chamber long after the others had left, poring over shipping manifests by candlelight. It took me 2 years to get that kind of support for anything. You inherited a civil war, Elira said, not looking up from the manifests. I merely inherited an argument. Arguments are easier to win than wars. Draven pulled out the chair across from her and sat, uninvited but not unwelcome, watching her work for a long moment in a silence that had grown over the past week into something almost comfortable between them. Corvin will not simply accept losing, he said eventually. He has spent 8 years being patient. Patient men do not become reckless because of one lost vote, they become more careful. I know, Elira said. I have been watching him as closely as you have. His eyes go to the door twice as often as anyone else's in that room, and always toward the south corridor, not the main one. I do not yet know what that means, but I intend to find out. She was right to be watching. 4 nights later, at nearly midnight, Fenna woke Elira with a hand pressed hard over her mouth and a whispered, urgent warning. Someone had been seen moving through the servants' passage outside her chamber door. Someone who did not belong to any household staff either of them recognized. Elira was out of bed and dressed within minutes a small dagger, a gift from her father, one she had carried hidden beneath her formal gowns since the day she left Viral, already in hand when the door to her chamber opened not from the main hall, but from a servant's passage that was supposed to be sealed. The man who entered was dressed as castle staff but moved like a soldier, and the blade in his hand was clearly meant for more than kitchen work. Elira did not scream. She had learned in the Grand Hall exactly what a room full of witnesses did with a woman's scream. And there was no room full of witnesses here. Only herself, Fenna, and a man who had clearly expected to find a sleeping, undefended target. She threw the heavy silver wash basin from her nightstand at his head with every ounce of strength her training had ever given her. And in the half-second of stunned confusion that followed, she and Fenna together shoved a heavy wardrobe against the servant's passage door while the intruder scrambled upright, cursing, blood running from a gash above his eye. And then Draven's personal guard, alerted by Fenna's earlier warning to the household steward, burst through the main door with drawn swords. The would-be assassin did not survive the capture. He fought rather than surrender, and Noxfall's guards, trained in a kingdom that had survived one civil war already, did not hesitate to end the threat rather than risk their queen's life on the chance of a peaceful arrest. But before he died, gasping on the cold stone floor with a Noxfall blade through his ribs, he said one thing, 3 words, spat more than spoken, in a language that was neither Viral's tongue nor Noxfall's. Draven, arriving moments later, went very still when Fenna repeated the phrase to him. That is Ashgrave dialect, he said quietly, staring down at the dead man's face. No one south of the Vareth Strait speaks that outside Ashgrave's own borders. Elira, still gripping her father's dagger with white knuckles, felt something cold settle deep in her stomach. Ashgrave, she repeated slowly. The kingdom south of Viral, the one my father always said was too weak and too poor to ever threaten anyone. Apparently, Draven said grimly, your father was wrong. And apparently someone in Ashgrave has decided that a peace between Viral and Noxfall is worth killing a queen to prevent. While Elira learned to survive assassins in Ravenspire, Viral was learning, slowly and painfully, exactly what it had lost. The trade routes Elira had reopened between Noxfall and the eastern provinces had a consequence no one in Viral's court had properly anticipated. Merchants who once relied exclusively on Viral's southern ports for northern goods suddenly had a faster, cheaper alternative through Noxfall's newly reopened border crossings. Within 6 weeks, 3 of Viral's largest trading houses had quietly begun rerouting shipments, and the port taxes that had funded a third of the crown's annual budget began, for the first time in a generation, to shrink. King Aldrich, Cassian's father, summoned his son to his private study on a gray afternoon that Cassian would later remember as the first moment he genuinely understood the size of his own mistake. Explain to me, the king said, not looking up from the treasury reports spread across his desk, why our port revenues have dropped 11% in 6 weeks, precisely 6 weeks after you humiliated the one woman in this kingdom who understood how to keep Noxfall's economic ambitions checked. Father, that's not, Cassian started. Elira Ashworth spent 4 years sitting in on your foreign policy briefings, Cassian, because you could not be bothered to stay awake through them yourself. She understood our trade relationships with Noxfall's border lords better than half my own ministers. And you handed her, along with everything she knew about us, directly to the one kingdom capable of using that knowledge against us, because you preferred a healer's daughter's smile. Cassian said nothing because there was nothing to say. He had not thought in the moment of the Grand Hall about treasuries or trade routes or 11 years of careful border strategy. He had thought only about a promise he did not want to keep, and a woman he had convinced himself over 8 months of stolen conversations during his recovery from fever that he genuinely loved. He still believed he loved Leora. That part, at least, had not changed. What had changed, what was changing daily, in ways that frightened him more than he admitted even to himself, was his certainty that loving her had been worth what it cost everyone else. Leora herself seemed, if anything, increasingly uneasy in the palace she had been elevated into. She had been given rooms near the royal quarters, a title of royal companion that satisfied no one's sense of propriety, and a stream of court obligations she had never been trained for etiquette correspondence. The delicate political dance of a court that had never fully accepted her, and now with Viral's treasury visibly bleeding, resented her more openly by the week. She found Cassian in his study one evening, staring at the same reports his father had shown him weeks earlier, and something in his face made her stomach twist with a fear she had been trying to ignore for months. "You're doing that thing again," she said quietly. "The thing where you look at me like you're trying to remember why you chose this." "I'm not," Cassian said too quickly. "Cassian." She sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap the way the etiquette tutors had drilled into her, a habit that still felt foreign after 8 months. "I need to tell you something. I should have told you months ago and I didn't because I was afraid of exactly this look on your face." He finally met her eyes. "Before I ever treated your fever," she said slowly, "I was approached by a man, a trader," he said, "from the southern provinces. He gave me herbs, rare ones, expensive ones, things a physician's apprentice could never normally afford, and told me they would help with a fever that was resistant to ordinary treatment. He was right, they worked. You recovered faster than the head physician expected, and everyone praised my skill, and I let them because I was young and proud and it felt wonderful to be seen for once in my life." Cassian's expression had gone very still. "What are you telling me, Leora?" "I'm telling you I don't know who that man really was," she said, her voice cracking. "I never saw him again after that, but he found me again 3 weeks ago, outside the palace kitchens. He didn't ask for anything this time, he just smiled, and told me he was very pleased with how well things had turned out and that Ashgrave sends its regards." The silence that followed stretched long enough that a servant, passing in the hallway outside, later told other servants that the prince's private study had gone so quiet she thought perhaps both occupants had left. "Ashgrave," Cassian finally repeated hollow. "You're telling me that the herbs that saved my life, the herbs that started everything between us, came from Ashgrave?" "I didn't know," Leora said, tears finally spilling over. "I swear to you, Cassian, I did not know what I was part of. I thought I was simply talented. You thought you fell in love with a prince because fate wanted it," Cassian said slowly, a terrible new understanding dawning across his face, "when really someone engineered the entire fever, the entire recovery. The entire everything, specifically so that I would fall in love with the healer who saved me instead of the woman my kingdom actually needed me to marry." He stood so abruptly his chair toppled backward, and for the first time since the Grand Hall. Cassian understood, with the sick lurching clarity of a man realizing he has been a piece on someone else's game board for the better part of a year, that his own broken heart may never have belonged to him at all. Somewhere 300 miles south, in a marble council chamber in Ashgrave's capital, a woman known to her own council only as the second voice read a coded report from her agent inside Viral's palace and allowed herself, for the first time in months, a small, satisfied smile. "The prince has finally noticed," she wrote in her private ledger in a hand as elegant and precise as any Noxfall royal decree. "No matter, noticing now changes nothing. The engagement is already broken. The peace between Viral and Noxfall is already forming in exactly the direction we predicted, and a queen with divided loyalties, fresh across an enemy border, surrounded by nobles who resent her, will be far easier to discredit than a prince ever was. Send word to our contact in Ravenspire, *, she added. It is time to begin the second phase. In Ravenspire, the weeks following the assassination attempt changed something quiet and fundamental between Elira and Draven, though neither of them named it aloud for a long time. He began attending her council sessions not to oversee her. She made it clear the first time he tried that she would not tolerate being supervised in the ministry he himself had granted her, but simply to sit at the edge of the room and watch her work. The way a man studies something he does not yet fully understand, but has begun cautiously to admire. She began seeking him out after those sessions initially to discuss the investigation into her attacker's Ashgrave connections, and then gradually. For reasons that had less to do with strategy, and more to do with the fact that his quiet, deliberate way of listening had become, without her quite noticing, when it happened, one of the few genuinely restful parts of her day. You flinch, he observed one evening, nearly 2 months into their marriage as they walked the castle's eastern battlements together, a habit that had become as routine as it was unspoken. Whenever anyone raises a hand too quickly near you, even in friendly gesture, I noticed it the first week. Elira considered denying it, then decided, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not want to. The Grand Hall taught me that people I trusted could turn on me without warning. The assassin taught my body the rest. I did not realize it was visible. It is, to someone paying attention. Draven kept his eyes on the darkening horizon rather than on her, which she had begun to recognize as his particular way of making difficult conversations easier to have. I flinched too, if anyone asks after my uncle's name too suddenly. Grief and betrayal leave the same kind of scar, I think, whatever caused them. Is that why you never remarried after your civil war ended? Elira asked. Everyone assumed you simply did not want a queen. I assumed the same until your letter arrived. I assumed it myself for a long time. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his next words with the same careful precision he brought to every treaty negotiation she had watched him conduct. I did not want a queen who needed me to be gentle with her. I have very little gentleness left in me most days. I thought that made me unfit for marriage entirely, until I began reading reports about a duke's daughter who removed her own engagement ring in front of 400 witnesses without shedding a single tear. And I thought, perhaps I do not need gentleness. Perhaps I need someone who does not require it. Elira stopped walking. He stopped beside her, finally turning to look at her directly, and in the fading orange light of sunset over Ravenspire's dark mountains, something passed between them that neither of them had planned for. When this had begun as nothing more than a cold, calculated peace treaty wearing the shape of a marriage. I did shed tears, she admitted quietly, just not in the hall. I fell apart in the corridor afterward where no one could see it and use it against me. I know, Draven said. Your maid told mine some weeks ago in confidence, thinking it might help me understand you better. I have not mentioned it until now because I did not want you to think I saw it as a weakness. Do you? No, he said simply. I think it is the reason you are the strongest person I have ever negotiated a treaty with. You did not survive that hall by feeling nothing, Elira. You survived it by choosing, very deliberately, when and where to let yourself feel it. That is not the absence of weakness. That is mastery over it. Elira did not have a ready answer for that, a rare enough occurrence that she found herself simply standing in silence watching this strange, careful, unexpectedly perceptive man who had married her for peace and was slowly, without either of them fully naming it, becoming something she had genuinely stopped expecting to find again after the Grand Hall. Someone who saw her clearly and was not frightened by what he saw. That fragile new closeness was tested sooner than either of them wanted. When Lord Corvin requested a private audience with the king 3 days later, an audience Draven out of long habit initially intended to hold without Elira present, until she pointedly reminded him that any meeting concerning Noxfall's trade or foreign policy fell by written and witnessed agreement. Within her own authority, Corvin arrived with a folder of documents and an expression of carefully rehearsed concern. Your Majesty, my queen. He inclined his head to each in turn, though his eyes lingered longer, colder on Elira. I bring troubling information, and I bring it to you both directly rather than allow rumor to reach you first. My agents have uncovered correspondence suggesting the man who attempted to assassinate our queen was not acting alone on Ashgrave's orders, but was in fact recruited through contacts inside Viral's own border patrol. Contacts, my sources suggest, that trace back to Duke Ashworth's household staff. The accusation landed exactly as intended, a blade wrapped in careful diplomatic language aimed directly at Elira's own father, and by extension at Elira's own loyalty. That is not possible, Elira said immediately, though even as she said it, a small, treacherous doubt flickered at the edge of her certainty. She had been away from her father's household for 2 months. She could not in honesty vouch for every servant in his employ with absolute certainty, and Corvin knew it, which was precisely why he had chosen this particular lie. I did not say it was proven, my queen, Corvin said smoothly. Only that it warrants investigation. Surely you of all people would want the truth uncovered, rather than allow suspicion to linger unaddressed. Draven's jaw had tightened, his eyes fixed on Corvin with an intensity Elira had not seen since the night of the assassination attempt itself. Show me the correspondence. Regrettably, the original documents were destroyed in transit, a fire, my sources tell me, though I have sworn testimony from the courier who read them before their loss. Corvin's smile did not waver. I understand this is not the ironclad proof either of you would prefer. But given the Queen's obvious personal stake in her own father's innocence, I would suggest an independent investigator handle the inquiry, rather than allow the Queen herself undue influence over its outcome. It was, Elira realized with cold clarity, a masterfully constructed trap. If she fought the accusation too hard, it would look like exactly the kind of defensive overreach that suggested guilt. If she allowed the investigation to proceed unchallenged, it would hand Corvin, and whoever truly stood behind him, months of opportunity to manufacture evidence, implicating her own father and by extension herself. She thought quickly, the way her father had trained her since childhood to think under pressure, and found to her own quiet relief that 2 months in Ravenspire's council chamber had sharpened that training into something even more precise. "I agree entirely, Lord Corvin," she said calmly. "An independent investigation is exactly what this situation requires. I would suggest we invite Viral's own royal investigators to conduct it jointly alongside Noxfall's. Since if my father's household is truly implicated, Viral's crown has every reason to want the truth uncovered as urgently as we do. And if it is not a joint investigation, will clear his name far more convincingly than a Noxfall inquiry alone ever could." Corvin's expression flickered, the smallest crack in his composure, there and gone so quickly that only someone watching as closely as Elira had learned to watch would have caught it. He had not expected her to invite Viral directly into Noxfall's internal investigation. It complicated whatever plan he or his true masters had constructed around this accusation. And complication, Elira had learned in 2 short months of Noxfall politics, was precisely the weapon that unsettled, careful, patient men the most. "Excellent suggestion, my queen," Corvin said, recovering smoothly, though the coldness behind his eyes had sharpened into something Elira recognized now as genuine, calculating anger. "I will arrange it immediately." When he had gone, Draven turned to her, something like awe mixed with concern in his expression. "You realize you just invited Viral's investigators into Noxfall's own capital, weeks after an assassination attempt on our queen. If this is truly Ashgrave's doing, you may have just handed them exactly the chaos they wanted." "No," Elira said slowly, working through the shape of it even as she spoke. "I think I just did the opposite. Corvin expected me to either fight the accusation, which would look defensive, or accept a Noxfall-only investigation he could quietly manipulate. He did not expect me to invite outside eyes that neither he nor his masters can control. Whatever Ashgrave is truly planning here, Draven, I do not think it was built to survive Viral and Noxfall actually working together against it." Draven studied her for a long moment, and this time, the almost smile she had learned to recognize in their first week of marriage finally became something closer to a real one. "That," he said quietly, "is precisely why I wrote that letter to your father 2 months ago. I did not know then exactly how right my instincts about you would turn out to be." The joint investigation Elira had proposed moved faster than even she expected, largely because Duke Ashworth, upon learning his own household had been accused, threw open every ledger, every servant's record, every correspondence in his possession to Noxfall's investigators without a single moment's hesitation. A transparency that within 2 weeks cleared his household entirely, and more importantly uncovered something far more useful than an alibi. Among the household staff records, Viral's investigators found a payment discrepancy in the accounts of a minor kitchen steward dismissed 8 months earlier for petty theft, a dismissal that cross-referenced against Ravenspire's own investigation into the assassin's movements. Place that same steward in a tavern near the Vareth Strait, crossing on 3 separate occasions in the weeks before the attack, meeting with a man matching the description of the same southern trader Leora Bennett had once described to Cassian. It was Cassian himself, working through his own private investigation into Leora's revelation, with a desperate urgency to salvage something from his catastrophic mistake, who finally connected the final thread, a merchant's ledger showing a large, untraceable payment routed through a shell trading company with a single owner of record, a woman known in Ashgrave's own court documents only by title, never by name. The second voice. Cassian rode for Ravenspire himself without royal escort, without his father's permission, arriving at Noxfall's border checkpoint travel-worn and desperate enough that the guards nearly turned him away before he convinced them, with genuine panic in his voice, that Queen Elira's life depended on what he carried. Elira received him in a small private chamber, not the throne room, both of them aware of how strange and precarious this reunion truly was, the man who had humiliated her in front of 400 witnesses. Now standing before her in the enemy kingdom she had married in the wreckage of that humiliation, asking for her trust. "I do not expect forgiveness," Cassian said immediately before she could speak. "I do not deserve it, and I am not here for it. I am here because I believe your life, and quite possibly both our kingdoms, are in more danger than either of us realized, and you are the only person I trust to actually understand what I've found." He laid out everything, Leora's confession about the herbs, the tavern meetings, the shell company, the second voice. while Elira listened in absolute stillness, her expression giving away nothing until he finished, at which point she rose, and without a word of explanation summoned Draven and Lord Corvin both into the room. Corvin's face, when Cassian repeated the evidence in front of him, went through a rapid, involuntary sequence of expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally, unmistakably, fear. "You knew," Draven said quietly, watching his own council lord with an expression Elira had never seen on his face before, not the cold command she associated with his political dealings, but something closer to genuine personal betrayal. "Not everything, but something. You have known something this entire time." "I did not know about an assassination," Corvin said quickly, too quickly. "I swear at your majesty on my father's grave I never intended, but you took their money," Elira said, the pieces finally clicking into place with sickening clarity. "Ashgrave has been paying you for information, my council votes, my investigation, my movements. And when their hired man failed to kill me, you tried to deflect suspicion onto my father's household to buy them time to try again." Corvin did not deny it. His silence was answer enough. "Why?" Draven asked, and for the first time in the entire conversation, his voice cracked slightly, the sound of a king who had spared this man's life 8 years ago, against his own council's advice, only to discover the mercy had been repaid with quiet betrayal all along. "Because you let my father die in disgrace instead of granting him an honorable execution," Corvin said, something raw and bitter finally breaking through his careful composure. "Because I have spent 8 years watching you rebuild everything he tried to take, while I was left with nothing but a seat at your council table and everyone's suspicion. Ashgrave offered me something you never did, Draven, the promise that when this peace collapsed and Noxfall fell back into chaos, I would finally be given back what should have been mine. And Ashgrave's true plan," Elira pressed. "What is the second voice actually trying to accomplish? Surely not merely my death or a single lord's petty revenge." It was Cassian who answered, his voice grim. "A war. Not a small one, a full war between Viral and Noxfall, fought this time with both kingdoms already weakened, already suspicious of each other. Right as Ashgrave's own military has spent the last several years quietly expanding beyond anything either of our fathers ever bothered to track, because neither of our kingdoms ever considered Ashgrave a genuine threat. If Viral and Noxfall exhaust themselves fighting each other again, Ashgrave inherits an entire continent with neither rival left standing to oppose them." The room fell into a heavy silence as the true scale of what they were facing finally settled over all four of them. "My father's court still believes Noxfall poisoned my mind against reason and stole away Viral's rightful influence over trade," Cassian said quietly. "If word of an Ashgrave conspiracy reaches him filtered through Noxfall alone, he will assume it is manipulation, another lie designed to further weaken Viral's position. He needs to hear it from someone he still, despite everything, trusts." He looked deliberately at Elira. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you," he said. "But you are the only person who can walk into my father's court and make him believe this threat is real before Ashgrave finishes what they started." Elira studied him for a long moment, this man who had once promised her a future and shattered it in front of 400 witnesses, now asking her to save the kingdom that had humiliated her. Standing in the castle of the enemy king, she had married in the wreckage of that humiliation and had somewhere in 2 impossible months genuinely begun to love. She turned to Draven instead of answering Cassian directly. "If I go," she said, "I go as Noxfall's queen, not as Viral's disgraced former betrothed, and I do not go alone." Draven's jaw tightened, the calculation of a king weighing genuine risk plainly visible on his face, but beneath it something steadier, something that had grown slowly across 2 months of careful mornings and honest conversations on the battlements. "No," he agreed, "you do not go alone. Whatever Ashgrave is building toward, they clearly intended it to break Noxfall and Viral apart before we ever had the chance to stand against it together. I think it is past time we showed them exactly how badly they miscalculated." King Aldrich of Viral received his son. The disgraced Noxfall queen he had spent 11 years training his court to fear, and the Wolf King himself into his throne room 3 days later, in a session so tense that the palace guards had been quietly doubled at every entrance before the meeting even began. Elira had rehearsed a dozen different approaches on the ride to Ashcrest Palace, but in the end standing once again in the same grand hall where her engagement had shattered barely 3 months earlier, she abandoned every rehearsed argument and simply spoke the plain, unvarnished truth. The way Draven's first letter to her had taught her mattered more than any polished performance. "Your Majesty," she said, addressing King Aldrich directly, 3 months ago I stood in this exact hall and removed a ring in front of 400 witnesses because your son chose comfort over duty. I do not raise that to wound him further. He has already paid a heavier price for that choice than either of us anticipated. I raise it because the very humiliation your court witnessed that day was engineered, deliberately, by a kingdom neither of us has taken seriously in a generation, specifically to fracture Viral and Noxfall apart before we could recognize a threat neither of our militaries has been watching. She laid out everything: the herbs, the second voice, Corvin's confession, the shell companies, the quiet, patient years of Ashgrave positioning itself to inherit a continent exhausted by a war it had engineered rather than fought. King Aldrich listened in a silence that gave away nothing, decades of political caution etched into every line of his face, until Elira finished and the throne room fell quiet enough to hear the distant sound of the palace fountains through the tall windows. "You expect me," the king said slowly, "to believe that the kingdom my father and grandfather spent their entire reigns fortifying against, the kingdom whose raids bled this treasury dry for over a decade, is somehow now my ally against a threat I have never once considered. Based on the word of the woman my own son publicly humiliated and the son who humiliated her. I expect you to believe the evidence," Elira said calmly, "which Viral's own investigators helped uncover alongside Noxfall's. I did not come here asking you to trust me, Your Majesty. I came here asking you to trust your own kingdom's investigators, whose findings I have brought with me in full. And to make the same choice I had to make 3 months ago, standing in the wreckage of a broken engagement. Uncertain whether the enemy offering me peace could be trusted at all. She let that land for a moment. I chose to find out rather than assume. I am asking you to do the same." It was Draven, unexpectedly, who spoke next. The Wolf King Viral's taverns had spent a generation mythologizing into a monster, addressing the throne of the kingdom his own father had fought 2 brutal wars against. "I did not send my proposal to your daughter's household 3 months ago purely out of political calculation, Your Majesty, though I will not insult you by pretending calculation played no role," Draven said. "I sent it because Viral's own reports on Lady Elira described a woman capable of surviving anything her enemies threw at her, and I needed, desperately, a queen strong enough to survive mine. I did not anticipate that the same strength that made her valuable to my throne would also make her the only person capable of uncovering a threat both our kingdoms were too busy hating each other to notice. I am not asking you to forgive Noxfall for 2 generations of border wars in a single afternoon. I am asking you to recognize that the enemy actually threatening your kingdom right now is not, and has perhaps never truly been, the one standing across the Varith Strait." King Aldrich was quiet for a long, waited moment, his eyes moving between Draven, Elira, and finally his own son, standing pale and silent at the edge of the hall, still visibly carrying the weight of a mistake that had somehow, impossibly, become the thread that unraveled a continental conspiracy. "And Ashgrave's next move," the king finally said. "If everything you have told me is true, they will know by now that their agent inside my court failed, that Lord Corvin's betrayal has been exposed, that their entire plan has been uncovered rather than concealed. What do you believe they will do?" It was Cassian who answered this time, his voice steady for the first time since he had ridden desperately for Ravenspire 3 days earlier. "They will move to force the war they wanted before we can fully coordinate against them. Ashgrave has spent years quietly expanding a military neither of our kingdoms has bothered to track. If their subtle plan has failed, I believe they will attempt something far less subtle. A direct strike, likely at the Thornvale border, timed to look like Noxfall aggression, forcing Viral into a war footing before this alliance between our 2 kingdoms can be formalized." Draven's expression had gone hard and focused. The calculating King Elira had first glimpsed negotiating with Lord Corvin, now fully present. "Thornvale Pass is the one border crossing both our militaries have maintained since the last war. If Ashgrave strikes there and dresses it as Noxfall aggression, they will not need years to break this alliance. They will only need hours." King Aldrich rose from his throne slowly, the weight of 30 years of careful, cautious rule visibly settling into a decision he would once have considered unthinkable. "Then we do not give them hours," he said. "Send word to the Thornvale garrison, Viral and Noxfall forces are to coordinate under joint command, effective immediately on my direct authority. If Ashgrave intends to strike that border and paint it as an act of Noxfall war, they will instead find both our banners standing together to meet them." The attack came 4 nights later exactly as predicted, a force of nearly 2,000 soldiers in unmarked black armor, moving under cover of darkness toward Thornvale Pass, clearly intending to overwhelm what they expected to be a lightly garrisoned border crossing and vanish, before dawn, leaving behind only enough evidence to implicate Noxfall in the eyes of a Viral court, primed for exactly that suspicion. What they found instead was a joint force of Viral and Noxfall soldiers, standing shoulder to shoulder for the first time in 2 generations, warned and waiting. Elira and Draven had ridden to the pass together against the strong objections of both their advisors, Draven arguing correctly. As it turned out that no soldier on either side would fully believe this fragile new alliance was real, unless they saw both crowns standing at the front line together sharing the same risk, rather than issuing orders from safety. The battle itself was brutal and short. Ashgrave's soldiers, clearly unprepared for a coordinated defense they had been assured by faulty intelligence would not exist. But it was not without cost. Elira, positioned near the joint command post reviewing troop movements with Draven, found herself directly in the path of a small breakthrough force that nearly overwhelmed the pass's eastern flank before Noxfall reinforcements could arrive. She genuinely fought. Her father's old dagger training finally proving its worth beyond ceremony alongside Fenna, who had insisted on accompanying her mistress to the border, and now fought with a captured sword at Elira's side, with a ferocity that surprised everyone who had ever dismissed her as a mere lady's maid. It was Draven who reached her in the final desperate moment, cutting down the last soldier bearing down on her with a speed and brutality that reminded Elira briefly and vividly of exactly why Viral's court had once called him a butcher, before he turned to her breathing hard. Blood on his blade and genuine fear still raw in his eyes, of fear she had never once seen him show in 2 months of careful, controlled diplomacy. "You are not permitted to die on a border I only just finished making safe for you," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he had never once allowed himself to voice aloud. "Noted, Your Majesty," Elira said, breathless, her own hands shaking now that the fighting had actually stopped. "Though I would remind you that you very nearly did the same 3 feet to my left less than a minute ago." "Then perhaps," Draven said, something breaking loose in his expression that he had clearly kept carefully guarded since the very first letter he had ever sent her, "we are equally foolish and equally fortunate. And I find that I would very much like to spend the rest of my reign finding out just how much more foolish and fortunate we might yet become together." It was not, by any measure, a conventional declaration of love. But standing in the bloodied wreckage of Thornvale Pass, 2 kingdoms' banners planted side by side for the first time in a generation, Elira found it was somehow exactly the declaration she needed: honest, unpolished, and entirely, unmistakably real. By dawn, Ashgrave's shattered forces had retreated south, their conspiracy exposed on every front, their carefully engineered war reduced to a single failed skirmish against an alliance they had never believed possible. The formal peace treaty between Viral and Noxfall was signed 6 weeks later, in the same grand hall where Elira's engagement had shattered, and where months later she had stood again to warn a hostile court of a threat neither kingdom had seen coming. This time the hall was filled not with hushed anticipation of scandal, but with something Viral's court had genuinely not witnessed in living memory: 2 crowns, once enemies, standing together at the center of the room, signing a document that formally ended 2 generations of border war. Lord Corvin was tried by Noxfall's own council for his betrayal, and in a decision that surprised many who expected Draven's old reputation for ruthlessness to demand execution, was instead stripped of his title and lands and exiled rather than killed. A mercy Draven explained quietly to Elira afterward, not as weakness, but as a deliberate signal to his remaining nobles that loyalty once broken would be punished severely, but not vengefully, a distinction he credited in part to 2 months of watching Elira govern with exactly that same careful balance. Ashgrave's ruling council faced with an exposed conspiracy, a failed military strike, and a newly unified alliance between the 2 kingdoms they had spent years trying to weaken, sued for a cautious peace of their own within the month. A peace neither Viral nor Noxfall trusted completely, but one both crowns agreed to monitor jointly. A new kind of vigilance neither kingdom would have considered possible before the Second Voices conspiracy forced them to finally look south instead of only at each other. Cassian's own reckoning came more slowly and more privately. His father did not strip him of his eventual claim to the throne. The kingdom's stability could not easily absorb that second shock so soon after the first, but the trust between them, Cassian confided quietly to Elira during one of the treaty negotiations, would take years to rebuild if it ever fully did. "I owe you an apology. I know cannot undo what I did," he told her, finding her alone on the same palace balcony where they had once, years earlier, made quiet promises to each other as much younger, much less complicated people. "Not just for the humiliation. For not seeing you clearly enough, even after 6 years, to understand you deserved someone who chose you on purpose, rather than someone who simply never got around to choosing anyone else. You did me an unexpected favor, Cassian, Elira said, and she found to her own genuine surprise that she meant it without a trace of bitterness. I do not say that to excuse what you did in that hall because it was cruel and it was cowardly and you should have told me privately, the way I said that day. But if you had never broken that engagement, I would have spent my life married to a man who settled for me, wondering quietly for decades whether I was ever truly wanted or merely convenient. Instead, I found out exactly what it feels like to be chosen deliberately by someone who had every reason in the world not to choose me at all, and who chose me anyway. Leora, for her part, had returned to her family's village months earlier. Her role in Ashgrave's conspiracy ultimately judged unwitting rather than treasonous, though the scandal had followed her regardless, an unfair inheritance she would likely carry for years. Cassian had offered, quietly, to support her regardless of what became of them romantically. She had refused, telling him gently that she needed to discover who she was outside of a story that had never truly been about her at all. Elira, hearing this secondhand, felt something unexpectedly close to sympathy for the healer's daughter, who had never asked to become a weapon in someone else's war. The final evening of the treaty celebrations, Elira found herself once again on Ravenspire's eastern battlements, now genuinely home to her in a way that would have seemed impossible 8 months earlier, watching the sunset she had come to know as well as she had once known Viral's palace gardens. Draven joined her, as he always did now, without needing to be asked. "Your father tells me you have been offered a formal ambassadorship," he said, shuttling between all 3 kingdoms to help maintain this new, fragile peace. He seemed almost as proud discussing it as he did the day you were born, which he mentioned to me entirely without prompting at least 4 times during dinner. "I told him I would consider it," Elira said, smiling faintly, though I already know my answer. "I have a trade ministry to run, a peace to help protect, and a husband who still occasionally needs reminding that flowers were not, in fact, entirely his steward's idea." Draven's mouth curved into that same rare almost smile she had first glimpsed on her wedding day, no longer rare between them now, but still precious for how hard one it had once been. "They were not," he admitted. "I asked the steward to arrange them. And then told you it was his idea because I did not yet know how to tell you in that first terrifying week that I very much wanted you to feel welcome in a home I was not yet certain you would choose to stay in." Elira turned to look at him fully, the mountain wind catching loose strands of her dark hair, and thought of the girl who had stood frozen in the grand hall 8 months earlier, quietly removing a ring that had once represented everything she believed her worth was tied to: a prince's approval, a kingdom's expectations, a future chosen for her rather than by her. She thought of how wrong that girl had been about what a ring or a crown or a title could actually measure. "I already chose to stay," she said quietly. "The day I chose to answer your letter honestly instead of politely, I think I already knew I would end up exactly here. Below them, in the valley beyond Ravenspire's black granite walls, the lights of a kingdom that had once been her nightmare and was now unmistakably. Her home flickered on one by one against the deepening dark, proof, if she had ever truly needed it, that the worst humiliation of her life had not been an ending at all. It had simply been the moment she finally stopped waiting to be chosen, and started choosing, deliberately and without apology, exactly the life she was worth.